Hi, and welcome to this Easter's training video. This is part of a two-part series on matter filing, with the first part being done by my good friend and co-CA Jack. That part focused on how to get knowledge and how to matter file. What this part will explain is how to use the knowledge that you have in debates to make arguments more persuasive. What we will be focusing on is four things. Firstly, some general principles as to how to use knowledge or spec in debates. Secondly, how we can use this to generate arguments. Thirdly, on how we can use it to make our arguments more persuasive. And fourthly, how to respond to spec arguments that you do not know much about. Firstly, on some general principles, I think there are three I want to discuss. Firstly, the Easter's format is always governed by the Ordinary Intelligent Australian Voter Standard. What this means is that the knowledge base of your judge is the knowledge base of the Ordinary Intelligent Australian Voter who reads domestic and international news sources. For example, they would read the front page of The Australian, the AFR, the New York Times, and The Economist, alongside other major domestic and international newspapers. They do not read this with necessarily a perfect memory, but they do indeed read it. Secondly, they have a good general knowledge of the world and of Australian domestic issues. For example, they'll know who the deputy leader is of the Liberal Party, they'll know where the Strait of Hormuz is, and they'll know the countries that border countries like Bulgaria. The second general principle to be aware of, which builds upon the first one, is that it's important to explain the mechanisms behind the spec example that you give. That is to say, if you are saying something that is a specialist claim that the ordinary intelligent Australian voter may not understand or accept on surface value, it's important to explain it to detail. And I would note that the ordinary intelligent Australian voter does not have specialist knowledge that many people would have by studying a university course into a certain subject, which means that it's important that you explain your arguments in a simple manner that is understandable. For example, instead of saying raising interest rates reduces inflation, what you should do is step through mechanisms. Explain that when central banks increase interest rates, the cost of borrowing becomes more expensive for consumers and businesses. What that means is that households can take out fewer loans, which means that their consumption decreases, and that when their consumption decreases and there's overall less demand in the economy, there's less pressure on prices because fewer people are competing for the same amount of goods, which means that firms can no longer raise prices as easily. The third general principle is you should try to explain things simply. Imagine that you're explaining what you were trying to say in a debate to a friend of yours at a pub. Explain things with everyday language that people are likely to understand. For example, instead of saying that studies show high-frequency trading increases volatility, you explain that high-frequency trading firms use algorithms to exploit millisecond price differences, and because they cancel most of their orders, which are already very large, instantly, they create artificial liquidity that disappears suddenly, which can cause a flash crash and cause volatility to increase. Next, I want to talk about how to use spec knowledge to generate arguments. I think when reflecting on the knowledge that you have about a certain topic, there are a few useful questions to ask. For example, who are the actors? What are their incentives? What constraints exist for them? And what institutional structures shape their behavior? And based on this, you can explain structural constraints as to why an actor is likely to do something particularly well or particularly poorly. You can explain how a topic can influence an actor's relationship with other aspects that may be a bit more indirect. And secondly, you can explain some second order consequences that may happen to peripheral issues or not so obvious actors or groups of stakeholders that the topic may not immediately draw your attention towards. For example, spec often allows you to identify hidden stakeholders. For example, in the debate that the ECB should raise interest rates, many teams will make arguments solely about the Eurozone and how this affects the European Union and countries within it. But if teams identify that there are many countries that peg their currency to the euro, for example, countries in the CFA franc zone, you can unlock a group of stakeholders who are affected by the topic, who are quite large and perhaps even more valuable. Additionally, you can spot unintended consequences of actions. For example, in the topic that we should ban countries from having time zones that do not align with longitudinal lines, you can identify that China is one of very few countries that do have a time zone that does not align with longitudinal lines, and you explain that the international community banning them from doing this could cause some geopolitical tensions, perhaps. Next, I want to talk about how to use spec knowledge to strengthen arguments. I think there are four things that are useful to think about as to how knowledge can make your arguments more persuasive. Firstly, they can explain how many people are affected. For example, if you know that a certain event affected 100 million people, and if that event was to repeat, it would be a really big issue, that can explain why you have a very wide-scaled impact. You can additionally explain how severe an impact is. For example, if you're talking about the effects of reducing unemployment in South Africa, knowing that over 30% of the South African population is unemployed can explain why that is a particularly important thing in the debate. Thirdly, you can explain how long the impact lasts by using examples of contexts where perhaps a policy's impacts were seen for many decades, or perhaps contexts where a policy's impact was seen for only a few weeks, can help explain why arguments are important or unimportant. And finally, you can explain whether the impact has been reversible throughout history. In all of those examples, using knowledge can help you really explain why the weighing that you're doing is something that isn't just analytically true, but has also been seen throughout the real world. Often there's a question of what do you do if you do not know about a particular area or you do not know about the topic. There are a few things that I think are useful. Firstly, similar contexts often have parallels in how things operate. For example, yes, the youth protests in Bangladesh and Madagascar were different events and they have many complexities associated with them. There's still some general shared traits as to what made them succeed. For example, the prevalence of social media, and knowing about how that played out in one context can help inform or guide how you can make arguments as to how it's likely to have played out in another context. Secondly, often there's similar principles that apply within areas of spec knowledge. For example, if you know a lot about consumer market goods and how supply and demand set the prices of products in society, you make very similar arguments about how supply and demand affect credit markets and how interest rates are priced. Finally, there are areas of spec that often cross-pollinate with each other. For example, arguments about art and religion often intersect. For example, the Catholic Church has historically curated a lot of art, commissioned a lot of art, and bought and sold a lot of art. And knowing things about religion and art therefore can help you understand both of those areas. For example, you can know how art has been a way that people have expressed religion, but you can also know how art has been heavily influenced by religion and religious organizations. The final thing I then want to talk about is how do you respond to spec arguments, or particularly high knowledge arguments that other teams are running when you do not know about the area that they're talking about. The first thing to notice is that in many instances, when people run arguments using a lot of examples, they can potentially run into correlation and causation problems. For example, a team may claim that that marijuana legalization reduces crime, and point to the example of US states where marijuana has been legalized and crime rates have fallen, and therefore they may make the conclusion that legalizing marijuana reduces crime. This may potentially be true, but you can point out when responding to this argument that this may be a correlation causation problem. You can explain that crime rates were falling anyway in many of the states where it was legalized. Secondly, you can explain that economic trends that exist exogenous of the legalization of marijuana is helping improve those crime rates. And finally, you can explain that there's a definitional question here. Obviously, if you make less things illegal, there's likely to be a reduction in crime, which is definitionally is people doing illegal things. Secondly, you can always respond to the mechanisms that teams make. Often, highly knowledgeable arguments still must rely on mechanisms that need to be analytically true. And often it's useful to break down what are the mechanisms that other teams have presented for their arguments and try to think of ways that you can respond to those individual mechanisms without getting into the weeds of the specific examples that they provide. Finally, it's useful to always exploit incomplete knowledge or respond to arguments that are made using spec knowledge with spec knowledge of your own. For example, if a team makes the claim that sanctions on Russia after 2014 and 2022 worked because they damaged the economy and constrained aggression, you can explain that yes, this was true in the short term, but in the long term, Russia was able to systemically adapt via parallel imports via Central Asia, which allowed them to access more goods, as well as rerouting energy exports through China and India. And then you can explain, as a result, Russia was still able to engage in a sustained war effort, and the effects of sanctions have been minimal, which allows you to mitigate the argument that was made. So overall, when using spec knowledge, the three things I want to leave you with is firstly, make sure that you're grounding your examples in things that the ordinary intelligent Australian voter would know. If they do not know it, make sure you take extra care to explain it very well. Secondly, use the knowledge that you have. Everyone is studying something at university, everyone knows things about the world, and often things that you know can be applicable to a debate, even if it's not immediately obvious in the first instance. But thirdly, when people use a lot of knowledge, don't get overwhelmed. Always look at what the base level mechanisms they're talking about are and see what you can respond to or what's perhaps missing that makes the overall debate more nuanced.